Welcome to the Therapist Burnout Podcast, episode 86. Hey, therapist, welcome back to the program. Today, I'm talking to you about a new burnout buzzword, quiet cracking. I'm just taking a pause there for a moment because I've been doing a deep dive into this new trend. Maybe it's not so new. Maybe I just stumbled upon it. But I wanted to talk about that, and I promised you I'd give you a little overview about what's happening with the podcast for the fall, and let's do it. Let's jump into it. So first, I might talk a little bit about podcasts. So for September, I'm going to do a little bit of back to basics, kind of back to burnout basics, because when I burn out of my therapy practice, which was multi-layered. And that's why I think going back to the basics of burnout is important because when I was burned out and depressed and dealing with anxiety and didn't know what to do with my practice, all of the above, struggling with clinical grief, all those things were happening. I was Googling therapist burnout. What is therapist burnout? This is coming from someone who wrote their dissertation in compassion fatigue, and I still didn't catch the signs. And I think going back to my episode on interoception, mental health providers we recognize something's happening in our body. I could recognize that I was maybe quietly cracking or loudly cracking. I have a tree shirt on today. So maybe it was like a sequoia tree, which is what this is, falling in the forest. Like that's not very quiet. But I think a therapist will identify with that term because we still show up. And that's why one of my, I think, top episodes, episode 70, which was something like dysregulated and burned out and still showing up, how to find safety. And so listen to that episode if you didn't listen to that already. I talked about this concept that we continue to show up until we're literally burnt, until we can't get out of bed, when our body is willing us not to get out of the car. So if that's where we are, a lot of times I think we fail to recognize what it is because it hits us and we can't it's like we couldn't fathom this is what it is because we have been pushing it down for so long. I kind of see it as like, a can of soda that's been shaken up over and over again. When you open it, that thing is going to just explode. And I think that's what happens to a lot of therapists, especially women who are caretakers, who do something in the helping profession. So I think this isn't unique to women, but women tend to burn out more. There's some research on that is very interesting. I saw one AMA study that indicated that women have higher rates of burnout than men. I guess that's not too shocking. But also, I've been talking about a 2025 study that's telling us that burnout rates are as high as 60 to 80%. Depending on the generation and like qualifications and things like that, burnout is becoming, I think, more front and center for a lot of folks, which is good in a lot of ways that hopefully we might have this conversation with more people. But I know that at least in the US, there are not a lot of supports for healthcare providers, for therapists. I think I am shocked that there's not. I think for doctors, there's more because there's more money with physicians than there are for therapists. I could get on my high horse all day long about all of this. So let's dive into a little bit of what quiet cracking is and how it's showing up on their interwebs. So quiet cracking. Let's get a new term. A new term describes the inner struggle of appearing fine while privately experiencing significant mental distress. Unlike quiet quitting, which is a conscious decision to disengage, quiet cracking is often unconscious unraveling behind a facade of normalcy. It's a person who consistently meets deadlines and contributes in meetings but goes home, cries, experiences panic attacks, or struggles with debilitating anxiety or depression. This phenomenon underscores how effectively individuals can mask their suffering in a professional setting. So I was kind of thinking of quiet cracking when I was watching Coco Gauff. So I talk about tennis. So if you're new to this podcast, hi, I'm Dr. Jen Blanchett, and I talk with you about burnout and therapists and mental health professionals. And sometimes I talk about tennis, and sometimes the two like come together. And I'm so happy that that is the case this week because it is US Open season. That is tennis. And Coco Gauff is an American tennis player. And there was a whole controversy with Taylor Townsend and microaggressions that I will, if people want me to talk about it, I will give a hot take. But I want to get to this and how it's related to this concept. But I was watching her play. So she's number 4 in the world. And throughout the tournament, she has been crying like between games, in between sets. And after the match, she's been visibly emotional and upset. And people are kind of, being like, is it too much for her? Is the pressure too much for her? My first response is like, how can the pressure of being a top tennis player not be a lot of pressure for people? How doesn't everyone not break down in tears in these settings? So that's my first take on that. I think so she's not quiet cracking. She was having cracks that were coming out. And I think when we get to that point, that was starting to happen to me where I was feeling like I couldn't control my emotions. So I was beyond the quiet cracking phase of really like I continued to show up. And why it made me think of Coco is she is winning at a high level. And those little bursts of emotions that are coming up is her body telling her, I can't hold this pressure. And I think that parallel and why I love athletes is because they have to operate at the highest level. Their mental health has to operate at the highest level to take that amount of scrutiny, to be under that amount of pressure, and to put your body through that many things. So I love the parallels with athletes and what they give us because I think it is like Mach 10, what you have to do to be a professional athlete. And so thinking of that and seeing her response to what happened at the US Open, and number one, I feel for her. I am a tennis player. I've played tennis all my life, and I have so much drama sometimes about how I play, and it's very low stakes. There is no money on the line. I don't have millions of dollars on the line, just my pride. And I actually did EMDR on myself for my tennis game. And at the root, when I wasn't playing well, it was embarrassment. I was embarrassed about losing or about not hitting the way I wanted to hit. And so I kind of had to when I got to that core of feeling shame and embarrassment with not having my top level tennis play of the day, because I think at my core I am an athlete. I love to train, I love to lift weights, and I think it's a great tool. It can also be very detrimental on our mental health. And I think at the highest levels we see that in our athletes. Um, but why this quiet cracking, I think new thing is coming out is because I think for a lot of therapists and people that are showing up every day in, day out, they appear fine on the surface. They appear as if things are going well. I know therapists that tell me week after week that they're just showing up, that they are holding space and falling apart after. And so I think this term can be helpful in describing an experience of going to work, showing up, and the aftermath is that literally you are falling apart. I think what it fails to capture is that perhaps we have a real mental health concerns that we need addressed. And as I have found out doing this podcast, we don't have great research for therapist mental health. We don't have great intervention. And we know our mental health system is obviously broken. So I think using terms like this, like therapist burnout in general, which is the name of this podcast, because that's what therapists call it, but it is so multi-layered and it could be legitimate mental health concerns. It just reminds me of when I worked with brain injury survivors. Many of them came to me because they were told that all their brain injury services had been already completed. Like they'd completed PT, they completed occupational therapy, and they were told now that they just have anxiety. And when they came to me, they were literally at the end of their rope. And they would tell me, they told me it's all in my head and it's just anxiety. And I need to go see a therapist because I need to work on my anxiety. And they felt so seen when I was like, I, yes, I do think it's anxiety. And all of this stuff happened from the trauma of your injury. And so that is why I became an EMDR therapist when I was working with people with brain injury, because they had gone through a trauma that other providers had failed to refer them to an appropriate professional. So whenever I would recommend another therapist besides me for someone with a brain injury, I'd recommend a trauma therapist because there's not a lot who would specialize in brain injury as well. I'm finding the thread. When we lack specificity in what we're calling something, it's going to delay our healing, delay our care, delay our treatment for what we need. I mean, just like me. So in the pandemic, I told myself I was burned out. And I was. And I was. I was also having acute panic attacks. I dealt with some of the deepest depression of my life, including suicidal ideation, living with anxiety. And that continued throughout my days and weeks. You would think, as a licensed psychologist, I would have recognized that that's what was going on. So I think that's why we have to move beyond this simple definition of burnout, that we have to move beyond, I think, these buzzy kind of things about what is happening and maybe I'm quite cracking. What the heck is that? So I just want to kind of go back to basics a little bit about what are these terms? What is therapist burnout? What is burnout in general? And I think going through that, and so having some episodes here on, I'm just going to talk about burnout, like what is the concept of burnout and compassion fatigue. So I'm going to just parse out all of these terms. But I think dovetailing this with mental health treatment is so important. One of my top downloaded episodes has been, is it burnout or depression? Because I think there's so much overlap in symptoms. I've just said that 3 times. Maybe I'll edit it, maybe I won't. In symptoms, and if you don't get treatment for that, if you don't get support for that, I think you can delay your care. And I do believe that changing your situation can be helpful, but it can also be masking some depression, some anxiety, or some other care that you might need, like trauma therapy if you've been exposed to trauma work or if you're a trauma therapist, for example. So, as I'm going to talk on the podcast, I'm going to dive deeper into granularity. I'm not going to talk on depression versus burnout because I just talked about that recently in episode 70. So, certainly check back to that episode, but I will pause here because on the shift, that is my monthly newsletter on LinkedIn, which I will also link in my therapist pen pal list. So if you're not on the pen pal list, you get all of my links to things. So I will share that and this article this week. So certainly sign up. That drops on Wednesdays. And I talk about depression and burnout so much because symptoms overlap. And when I dove into the research, I found that basically it does come up in the research that burnout and depression, according to researchers, often looks indistinguishable. And I think because the overwhelm, the fatigue, the personal the lack of personal efficacy can feel like depression, can look like depression. And I think the only context that the ICD 11 definition gives us is that it is an occupational phenomenon. For therapists, I would argue that our job bleeds into a human phenomenon. And I think for many caring professionals, our roles bleed into who we are. And so, how can they not touch our personhood? That is what I talk a little bit more in that section. I think for therapists especially, compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma blur that edge even more. So it's my hope to really talk about my lasagna metaphor for therapist burnout, that it is layers of things on top of each other, and getting really granular is important. And I think depression is part of that because often burnout can look like that. Furthermore, coupled with modern life, we know that depression rates, anxiety rates have skyrocketed, especially for Gen Z, since the advent of smartphones. So since about 2010, when smartphones came out, the rates of depression, anxiety, especially for our younger humans, have skyrocketed. And I think there's been a lot of speculation about Gen Z is weak. Like they just, they can't hack life. And as I talked about in the shift, I'm going to jump around here, but I say Gen Z is the burnout canary in the coal mine. They're the most vulnerable to its effects. If you think about Gen Z, okay, they came up in the advent of the smartphone. They spend way more screen time. They spend way more of their life on screens. So, if let's say, I think I've seen some research that says older generations like millennials, Xers, and boomers, like probably even less screen time than Gen Gen X and millennials, which we spend maybe 3 to 4 hours of screen time, and that could be upwards than Gen Z, who spends upwards of 9 hours on their screens. And so I think this is a huge part of why they're burning out. I think other people have argued we can't know for sure because we can't put Gen Z into a randomized study without their phones, likely, and extrapolate that to the general population for their whole generation. That if we take away smartphones, because it's part of their development, it's part of how they were raised to be constantly connected. And we know that being constantly online, constantly connected digitally translates, so it seems, to be more isolated in reality. So I found this quiet cracking term from a Fortune article. So they claim that half of workers are at their breaking point, and it's costing $438 billion in lost productivity. I think burnout is having a moment because it's costing us a lot of money and productivity and time. And so for big business knows that it's costing them so much. So they're pouring money in to stop, by offering wellness apps. I see it because I'm on a group, insurance plan of these wellness things that get added into plans and EAP services that are getting pushed more, which if you talk to any therapist, like I never took a EAP, maybe it's changed, like write to me and let me know if you found an EAP service that actually pays therapists well, because I haven't seen one. I think maybe I saw some in some therapist groups that they're paying a little bit better. But typically, at least when I started out over 10 years ago in private practice, I looked at a few EAP reimbursement rates and I was like, I don't get out of bed for that. No, I'm not getting out of bed for $50 an hour. No, thank you. Not doing it. So, so I think that's why there aren't a lot of providers that will take EAP services. That's if you're overseas, that's employee assistance programs. And we have those in the US, and companies will give these services to their employees to help mitigate concerns related to mental health. Many times there are session caps on those EAP services. So maybe they can get 3 sessions and then that's it. I hear, in different parts of the world, though, therapy is much harder to access than here. So we think, oh, we only get these 3 sessions with EAP, or we are kind of capped on our mental health services here in the US, where in other parts of the world, there is like basically zero access to therapy unless you have money, unless you can pay out of pocket, then there's access. But otherwise, there's not access. Zooming out globally, there's just a lack of access across the board. Anyway, back to big business. So where they treat this wrong, this article says, well, we should give our employees new tasks and reassign their jobs perhaps and see if you can kind of work the system to help mitigate this quiet cracking that looks to me like anxiety and depression versus burnout. And the last time I checked, when I was depressed, when I've seen people depressed, when I talk with people who are depressed, they don't need more tasks at all. At all, not by any stretch of the imagination. What I've seen in other research studies that state that individual practices to mitigate burnout, such as giving someone a mindfulness based intervention or gratitude practices, they do help. They do help. I think if you're doing that, you're doing something that's good, but it's not the whole picture. So we also need organizational systemic change to happen in the organization to manage what's going on in the environment, because I think we can help the individual, but if we put them right back in the situation that's burning them out, it does little good to help them really thrive in that environment. And we don't have great research on organizational burnout intervention. So that's what that article pointed to. There is just a lack of research in understanding or what specifically organizations can do to promote the systemic change that might be needed for burnout prevention. My quote on that is, a culture fix without clinical and organizational backbone is just a band aid on a crack in a dam. So we are just, seeing what's going to go. Let's put in a wellness app. Is that going to happen? Or let's do some gratitude journals. There can't be a one pronged approach to burnout. And I think that I get as well from my work with brain injury recovery, because there was no one approach to brain injury recovery that worked for all people, because people are nuanced. I think it's going to take all of us. It's going to take organizations. It's going to take individual interventions. It's going to take mental health awareness for burnout and screenings for depression, treatment for depression as well, to, I think, make a dent in what we're experiencing. So also thinking about like the progression. So if quiet cracking is what I'm calling 3.0 of burnout, let's think about maybe what has happened in the pandemic. So first we had the Great Resignation, where nearly 100 million Americans quit their jobs over 2 years. And that doubled quit rates than we typically see them, which is around like 1 to 2% in the US. And globally, I think it was also a phenomenon that we saw. People left their jobs. And I think the gift the pandemic gave us was that work isn't everything. When the world stopped, when work really changed, I think we had this moment and this pause in our consciousness to say, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And what is important? Because we all had this existential crisis as a human race together. There was a real threat of death. And then we had to kind of realize, like, what do we want out of life? And I think that was the gift of the pandemic, and which made a lot of people change gears, change directions, find new fields. For me, close my practice. And I think for other people, still questioning, like, is this the path that I want to be on? And I think in 2022, we saw the rise of the phenomenon of quiet quitting, where workers pulled back, not really leaving, but doing like as little as possible. And I think there's certainly like an edge to that, like there are people that that you've worked with probably that barely do anything and get paid for that. And I'm not agreeing to that. And also the people that I know don't do that. They try to do their best work. They try to show up. They try to give 110%. That's always the quote, like, I give 110% to my job, when maybe we need to give less. And if you want more from me, then pay me for more. Then pay me for my labor. And I think, again, after 2010, when smartphones followed us, when work starts following us everywhere we go, work is constantly there. And so if work is constantly with us, we're never off, we're never resting. And so this quiet quitting revolution of like, I'm out at 5 o'clock, that's it. Like, we're done. I can't do it. I was actually talking to my neighbor, and I just feel like maybe we need to like have 10% of being unbothered in our work. But we were talking about, we had our doctor actually that we shared together, my personal physician, decided to go private pay, and I was not able to afford his private pay rate. It was like 6,000 a year to continue to be in his practice, and that just not available to us right now to pay 6,000 a year on top of our premiums, on top of testing and all the other things, which I think we already pay like 4 or 5,000 in our healthcare, which we have very good healthcare for our family, which I'm grateful for. And it's still like, that's still a good chunk of change, right? That's still a lot of money to pay in healthcare. I digress. But we were talking about referrals, and I've been waiting to get into a primary care physician for a year, and I have my appointment next week or next month or something like that. And we're both dealing with like low back stuff. And she's telling me how, oh, guess what? We get into this new practice. If you need a referral, it's 10 to 12 days. And she was telling me the receptionist online, and she was just like, I don't know, like people have cancer and people have this and people have that. And it just takes a long time. And I was like, did they really tell you that people have cancer? That was their reason why a referral takes 10 to 12 days? Oh my gosh. And so maybe don't go that far into the quiet quitting phase at all, but maybe 10% of that. Like we're not going to go to that extreme and just be totally unbothered and insensitive and perhaps traumatizing to people. That would be the edge of that. But a part of that, like it just takes as long as it takes. Yeah, I can't get on top of referrals the next day like my independent doctor did, which he did a great job. And kudos to him for going private pay and having that work for him. And I wish I could be with him, but I can't. I think this concept of quiet quitting, I think it's harder for private practice therapists because it's your practice, it's your name. And of course, you want to be seen as doing a good and competent job and following up and doing what you need to do. And also, like working, which is one of my mottos, working at a normal human pace. Working at a normal human pace. That's what I think true quiet quitting needs to be. We need to quit overworking. We need to quit giving 110, 120% to our jobs because you need to keep some for yourself. You need at the end of the day to have reserves for your kid who is freaking out, for whatever comes up in your personal life, to have a hobby, to have fun, to enjoy this one life. That's why I love quiet quitting. And I think we need to go back to it. So quiet cracking is our new iteration. And I think that has happened before, but I think we are under a pressure cooker of stress. With Gen Z being our canary, they're letting us know work is not working. And I hear it from you, from therapists all the time. People write into me telling me they are hopeless. And I have thought about not doing this podcast because it is a lot of work. And when I get those messages, when people tell me, like, you have helped me leave my job, you have helped me, and just by listening to this, not even paying me anything, you have helped me do that. I know I'm onto something. I know that it is resonating at a level. And every time someone writes an email to me, I read them all, even if I don't get back to you. You know what? Okay, squirrel brain. Because if you are like me, you are a squirrel brain too. My dream is to like really have the therapist pen pal list be we have multiple therapists who are pen pals, and it's a paid list. And if you need to talk to a therapist, not for therapy, but you just need like that peer support, that I have other therapists that help me write you back. And you can get a love letter if you need to hear it. That is the vision. I know it feels uncertain. You feel stuck. And that's why we're seeing it. That's why we're seeing what's coming up, that people are feeling like they can't work the way they're working anymore. And I think that it on paper, things look stable in the job market. Oh, we don't have people quitting. It's stabilized. But burnout still remains 60 to 80% of workers that are surveyed. In closing, I want to offer you a different take on quiet cracking. It is not failure. No, it's your body telling you, and something is wrong. Something is really wrong if you are getting emotional and you can't toggle it down. If you are pulling into work crying, if your body is screaming, your body's doing its job because something is wrong and you keep putting it in this position. I know this because I did this. This was me. I was you. It may be a legitimate physical or mental health condition that you need help with. And so I always say, talk to your doctor first, talk to your therapist first, get the medical and psychological support that you need first and foremost. Let's just take care of that. If you're a leader listening to this and you have employees, I would say take heed. Get your employees the physical and psychological support they need, the real support they need, and start having these conversations about how can we change this programming? How can we change work so it's more sustainable? If we're getting this feedback, if people are leaving, what is happening? Start really listening to what is happening to people and what they're saying. Because if people keep leaving, it's not just them, it's the environment. And if you're hearing this and you have been quiet cracking, you have been dealing with burnout, I would say connect with me on the pen pal list. I offer support. I offer all the links to everything. Find me on LinkedIn, Dr. Jen Blanchette. And I think for a lot of us, maybe you're not at that point where you're, dealing with the height of burnout, but it's slow. You've made some changes, but like it's not sustainable. That to keep going, to keep trying to find, and I won't say balance, but to find a life you want to live right now. Because I think we all deserve to feel more freedom at work, or more freedom in our lives. And I believe it's possible, whether that's quitting your job, closing your practice, finding new ways to work. Even if you're in private practice, maybe quitting overworking, terminating with some clients that you no longer feel effective. That has been some of the work I didn't realize that I would do in clinical consultation with therapists, of helping them clean out their caseload, we clear the space. We clear the space. We can put things in that we want. That is huge. And that is some of the work that I do with therapists that I'm so passionate about, that they just feel like they don't have permission to do it. That I just keep showing up every week. I keep seeing these clients year after year. You don't have to do that. If you need permission, I grant it. I am excited to kind of talk with you more about like the basics of therapist burnout and the takeaways that you can have. So join me next week. I'm going to talk a little bit about the layers of therapist burnout, what we might be experiencing, and how